Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to share with you 7 questions to help you teach critically despite the attacks on anti-racism education and critical race theory. So these are some questions you definitely want to bring back to your leadership team, to your professional learning community, your grade level team, or whatever team that you're a part of and that you're working on. I believe these questions will help us recalibrate and generate new possibilities about how we maintain our disposition and our orientation to teach critically and to teach powerfully to make the world more racially just despite the current conditions and environment in which schooling takes place. I'm super excited about this episode. I hope you enjoy it. So let's go.
You're listening to the Racially Just Schools podcast, the show that provides resources to help you and your team build racially just schools. Now, here's your host, Dr. Terrance L. Green.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. My name is Dr. Terrance L. Green, and I am your host, and I am super excited. I am elated. I am deeply grateful and humble that you're back here again for another episode. Now, on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about 7 questions to help teach critically despite the attacks on anti-racist teaching and critical race theory. And so, to kind of lay the context for this, you know, we're in a new school year. It has started. And to be honest, this year is off to a very unique start, to say the least. You know, adults and youth are returning to schools in some of the most racially and politically contested conditions we've seen in a while. And, you know, this isn't necessarily new, but there are a couple of things that further complicate this school year that make it unique. So a couple of things. On the one hand, you know, we're still living with COVID-19, and the Delta variant has pretty much taken on a life of its own. And, you know, and to make matters worse, we have elected officials in states that are requiring students and adults to return to schools without any mask. You know, well, thankfully, there have been superintendents and there have been school boards that have defied legislation that is requiring students to go to school without a mask. And so mad props and shout outs to the school boards and the superintendents who are placing safety front and center and beyond political mess, right? But at the same time, we're still battling with the deep and profound and embedded ways that structural racism, white supremacy, and anti-blackness continue to shape schooling, particularly in the U.S. context and abroad. In this current iteration, though, what we see states putting forth and passing legislation to ban anti-racist teaching, but also the alleged teaching of critical race theory. And now, just to be completely upfront and honest, I don't know of any school, PK-12, that is teaching critical race theory. I personally didn't learn about critical race theory until I was in a doctoral program, right? So I was a full adult, you know, by the time I learned about critical race theory, right? But here's the thing. This at all is not about critical race theory, right? All these policies and all the legislation is not at all about critical race theory. This is actually unfortunate that critical race theory got caught in this larger white lash against the racial justice movements that have been going on since the beginning of time, but they entered the mainstream media in a brand new and in a renewed and fresh way in the summer of 2020. So this is not about critical race theory. And to be completely honest, this is more about maintaining and protecting the white racial status quo, white power interests, white comforts, and also like white fallacies and ideologies about the racial realities of the U.S. And the thing is, as long as there are policies to protect that, that's always antithetical to racial justice work in school. Right. And so my thing is, like, if any of these elected officials were serious about improving the lives of young people in schools, particularly those who are Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, Latina, and Asian, if they were at all concerned about improving that, then they would not be focused on a theory that explains racism, but rather they would be working to actively disrupt the everyday ways in which racism shows up in schools. And so even in the midst of these troubling and contested conditions, the reality is that teachers still have to teach, right? That teachers still have to show up in classrooms every day. Like this is the reality. This is the truth. This is just me keeping it 100 with you. And so it's not enough for us to just critique these policies in these conditions. And I want to be clear. I do think we should certainly critique them, these policies and these conditions. And we also have to be politically and strategically savvy to remain committed to the work of racial justice and building schools with radical humanity at the core, right? But the question still remains, what might teachers actually do to maintain this critical disposition and orientation to teaching in ways that work towards building a more racially just world and society? So I want to talk to you about kind of like two foundations before I go into these 7 questions that I think will be, very useful for you and the team that you're working on. The first thing is that I think it would do us some good to shift our perspective to focus on the possibilities. So the reality is like, look, Black people, indigenous folks, Black and brown folks have been contending with the taken for granted truths, narratives, ideologies around white supremacy and curriculum since the inception of schooling in the U.S. Right. And this is no different. And so the question now becomes, not what or if, but the question becomes how. Right. And so when we lead with questions around like how and how might we, it opens up powerful opportunities to create new possibilities, even despite the conditions and the context in which we're in. And I want to be super clear is that we still have agency to act, right? And we must always exercise our agency to act and never forfeit that, because building racially just schools, working towards racial liberation, is deeply, deeply important, and the stakes are too high for our children for us not to do that. The stakes are too high for Black children, for indigenous children, for Latina, Latino, Latinx, and Asian youth. So I still believe there are some things that we can do. And I think the place that we start is we start from our place of agency and we work out from there. One of the things I teach in the questions that I often get in this work is like, where do you start? And I have multiple ideas about where to start, which is, based on a number of things, just figuring out kind of like where you are. But you start in part with your place of agency, and you start there and you work out, right? And so before I share a few ideas with you, I just have a few disclaimers. The first one is that the list of questions that I'm going to share with you, this is not an exhaustive list, right? This is an initial list. This is a list to get you started. And I wholeheartedly invite you to add to this list, expand this list, formulate questions that are your own. The second thing is that it's okay to start small, right? And so in other words, it's all right to just start with 1 lesson or 2 lessons or a unit. Or, don't let me stop you. If you want to do the whole curriculum right now, by all means, please do that. Nonetheless, you have to get started. You have to get going. You have to get moving on this. And even if you start small, it's okay. We're not staying there. We're continuing to work towards these larger structural transformation for racial justice, right? And then finally, my suggestions about, some questions to ask about how teachers might begin and continue to teach critically despite these attacks on critical race theory and anti-racism teaching is not my acceptance of the conditions or of these policies. I am in complete opposition to these policies. However, I also understand the reality that teachers still have to show up in classrooms and teach, right? And so the foundation of what I'm going to share in these questions is around the wedding and the integration of these two ideas of to critique and to create, right? So at the heart of the questions that I'll share, these 7 questions, there's this idea and this intimate and vital relationship between critique and creation. So in other words, it's not just about dismantling, but it's also about building. It's about rebuilding. And I truly believe that our work is profoundly more powerful when we don't just only deconstruct and critique, but we also reconstruct and create. To say it simply, it's a both and approach. And so what do I mean when I say these words critique? And what do I mean when I say these words create? Because oftentimes we can use terms, but we don't invite people into the terms or the meaning that we've made beyond these ideas. And so what I mean by critique, or I'll use a synonym, deconstruction, I simply mean to break down the taken for granted ideas, truths, and the racial political ideologies that have been normalized and just seem just like second nature, and to make them very apparent, right? And so as you do this, you also, if you're working in a school, if you are working as a classroom teacher, if you're working in a district, you also, in your deconstruction, you need to be cognizant and you need to be aware of the state standards that you have to teach for a particular content area. And I can hear somebody now saying, well, those state standards, they're limiting at best. And, I wouldn't disagree with you, right? But here's the thing. You are working in a system and you're working on a system all at the same time, right? So you're working in a school district, you're working in an actual school, and you're concurrently, simultaneously working on that system, on that district, on that school to make it racially just. And so when you're doing both of those things at the same time, it creates a lot of tensions, a lot of contradictions, and a whole lot of messiness. But here's the thing. We should expect and we should enter into the contradictions, the tensions, and into the messiness, because those are the mechanisms, the portals, the avenues, the ways through to where we're trying to go. But then alternatively, when I use the word creation or synonym reconstruction, I mean to build, right? I mean to co-construct new knowledge with students and with adults. And this is so useful when it's done in concert with critique and deconstruction, because it is also integrated with creation, right? So instead of giving you a list of to-dos, I'm now going to enter into some questions for you and your team to think deeply about, to critically discuss, and to use as a frame to inform your actions. And so I use the language in these in these questions around we/I, right? To include individuals, but also to account for the collective work that you will do together. And again, I want to encourage you, if you're working alone, to work in solidarity with people, because this work isn't just about you. And there are some profound things we can do when we are working together and we're working collectively and collaboratively. Before we get into this, I have to just shout out and give flowers to and major props to all of the teachers, the school leaders, the custodial workers, the engineers that's keeping the buildings warm or cool, the cafeteria workers, the bus drivers, the teachers' aides, the students, the school leaders, the families, any and everybody that is working to help schools be racially just. I salute you. I thank you. And I appreciate you. Of everything that everyone is doing, we want to focus in on particularly those folks who are working in classrooms, right? And there are 7 questions that I want to share with you here. As we come into these 7 questions, I want to first underscore the idea of this word question. The root of that word is quest. And I believe that good questions can send you on a path, on a journey to generate new solutions and possibilities to pressing concerns that are often beyond like the existing and the laying around solutions that currently are available. That's why I like to start with questions, not with answers, right? In the important and powerful part about starting with questions is that it allows you to gather the expertise, the wisdom, the lived experiences of the people within your context to begin to build solutions and possibilities based on the people that you are working with. Okay. And as I said before, I use the terms we/I to account for yourself, but also the collective in your teaching. All right, here are the questions without any further ado. And I'm just going to simply read the questions to you. I've decided to suspend my commentary on the questions primarily because I want you to be able to take up the questions within your context in ways that are rich and unique to the people that you are working with, right? So I'll suspend my commentary for another time about these questions, but I think they're pretty straightforward. So here we go. Question number one is, how might we/I use the content from this class to equitably address some challenges that our community may be experiencing through critical youth participatory research? I'll read that one again. The question is, how might we use the content, how might we/I use the content from this class to equitably address some challenges that our community may be experiencing through critical youth participatory action research? So, participatory action research is a whole body of scholarship around that, how to do it, what's the underlying assumption. So I would definitely point you in the direction to look up some of that work. The second question is, how can we/I use critique as a tool to co-create knowledge that makes racial power relationships, patterns, and the racial status quo evident? I'll read it again. Question number two is, how can we/I use critique to create knowledge that makes racial power relationships, patterns, and the status quo evident? The third question, how can we/I constantly hold space to be a student with and also a teacher with critical humility in and out of the classroom daily? And what I mean by the word hold space, I literally just mean create the conditions for this type of interaction to occur. I'll read the question again. How can we/I constantly hold space to be a student with and be a student, especially with racially minoritized youth,